Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling something that's been a mainstay in the corporate world for feels like forever, um, organizational resizing. But we're not just going to skim the surface, right? We're going deep.
Right.
We're exploring the human impact, the business side of it, and whether those two ever really align.
Yeah, you know what's so fascinating about this topic is that resizing, it's often presented as this like purely strategic move, right? All about efficiency in the bottom line.
Yeah.
But it's so much more complex than that. It touches on really fundamental aspects of the like psychological contract between employers and employees.
Right. And it's so easy to get lost in the jargon.
Yeah.
People throw around terms like right sizing, streamlining, synergies,
Right.
but these terms represent real people's lives. So to guide us through all of this, we're going to be diving into some excerpts from Resizing the Organization by Kenneth P. Demuse. We've also got some research papers that analyze the impact of downsizing. And I think most interestingly, we've got some accounts from executives and HR professionals who've been, through these situations.
Yeah, these firsthand perspectives are really crucial because they give us a glimpse into what it's actually like to go through these periods of uncertainty.
Right. It's not just numbers, it's people.
Exactly.
So this deep dive is all about understanding the full picture. So before we even get into it, I want to ask you, have you ever been through a downsizing or a merger? What was that experience like for you?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, chances are if you haven't experienced it directly, you've probably seen it happening all around you. I mean, think about it. The corporate world is in constant flux, right? Companies merging, acquiring, restructuring all the time, it seems like.
Right. So let's set the stage here. What are some of the main drivers, I guess, behind this constant reshaping of businesses?
Well, there are a bunch of forces at play. Globalization, that's definitely intensified competition, right?
Yeah.
Pushing companies to find those efficiencies wherever they can. Then there's the lasting impact, I think, of the tech bubble bursting that triggered massive layoffs in the early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
And then, of course, we can't forget economic slowdowns, like the one we seem to be in right now,
Hmm.
often force companies to make those hard decisions about their workforce.
It's crazy to think back in the early to mid 90s. Over 35% of employees, they said that they worked for an organization that had downsized within the past year. That's a huge number.
It is. It really shows how common these practices have become. And the thing is, it's not just a one-time event.
Yeah.
These shifts, they impact everyone.
Hmm.
From the executives, at the top, to the employees working every day, to the customers who rely on these businesses.
It ripples out.
Yeah, it does.
So we've got this kind of swirling, landscape of change. Let's zoom in on the human impact. You mentioned the psychological contract earlier. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that even mean, and how does it relate to all of this resizing?
Sure. So the psychological contract, it's essentially this unspoken agreement, right, between employers and employees. It's those expectations around things like job security opportunities for growth, fair treatment, and so on. And when a company resizes, it kind of shatters that contract, right? It leaves employees feeling really unsettled, betrayed even.
So it's not just about the practicalities of, losing a job. It's about this like fundamental breach of trust.
That's exactly it. And the data really backs that up. You look at work trends data, it shows that employee fulfillment, it plummets after a downsizing, and particularly when it comes to those feelings of security. Imagine going to work every day wondering if you're going to be the next one let go. It's just not a good feeling.
No. And what about the people who stay?
Yeah.
The survivors, as they're called sometimes.
Right.
It can't be easy to, watch your colleagues lose their jobs and then just like keep going.
You're so right. And that's what we call survivor sickness. It's a real thing, and it can be so harmful to people and the organization as a whole. It can be guilt, anxiety, increased workload, decreased morale. There's this sense of like, why me? Why was I spared when others weren't?
Yeah, I mean, there's this feeling of like almost a dark cloud over everything.
Yeah.
And it's not hard to imagine how that would impact productivity and, creativity and all that.
It does. And one of the personal accounts that we read, and a company saw this surge in prescriptions for anti-anxiety meds after they announced layoffs.
Oh, wow.
So it's a real thing.
It's a very real thing. And so it begs the question, I guess, is it even worth it? Do layoffs actually lead to, the improved financial performance that companies want?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? And the research is kind of interesting. It's not as clear-cut as you might think.
Okay, tell me more.
So there's not this like solid evidence to support that idea that downsizing always equals, better finances. Demuse, Bergman, and Wayhan did this study where they found that downsizers were often less profitable than companies that expanded their workforce or stayed stable.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's not this magic bullet that people think it is?
Not necessarily, no. And then you've got to consider the hidden costs of downsizing. The hit to morale, the loss of all that talent, and the damage to the company's reputation. Those can be so hard to bounce back from.
Right. So if cutting jobs isn't the answer, what are some alternative approaches? Did any of the companies in the research do something different?
Yeah, definitely. There's a case study in the book about Enwave. It's this Silicon Valley company. They design, components for broadband wireless systems.
Okay.
And they were hit hard by the downturn in the telecom industry. So, they had to make some tough decisions.
Yeah, so they were facing a real crisis. How did they approach it differently?
Well, they didn't do the mass layoffs. Instead, they tried to do voluntary reductions, and they also provided training for their managers on how to deliver bad news, with empathy and sensitivity.
So they were trying to soften the blow a little bit.
They were, and it's worth noting that, this approach wasn't just about being nice. It was actually a smart business decision, too.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm definitely curious to hear more about their specific strategies and whether it worked. But
yeah,
let's take a quick break and we'll come back and dive into that.
Sounds good.
So before the break, we were talking about Enwave, this Silicon Valley company, and they were, trying to navigate this telecom downturn. And they took this different approach to resizing, one that really focused on empathy and respect for their employees. Did it work?
Yeah, it's a good example of, even when a company's in a tough spot, they can still hold on to their values. So Enwave's approach was interesting. First off, they were really transparent. They talked to their employees, openly about the challenges and the possibility of workforce reductions.
So that seems like a key difference, right? A lot of companies try to hide things or keep people in the dark.
Oh, for sure. Open communication, it's so crucial during times of change. Enwave got that. Then instead of mass layoffs, they implemented this voluntary separation program.
So they gave people a choice in the matter.
Exactly. They offered really good severance packages, outplacement services to people who were willing to leave voluntarily. So they reduced their workforce, but without forcing anyone out, which really helped with morale, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they were trying to minimize that trauma.
Yeah.
Both for the people leaving and the people staying.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. They knew that even during a downsizing, you got to treat people with respect, with dignity. They also did training for their managers, to help them have these tough conversations.
To do it with empathy.
Yeah. And it's important to point out, this wasn't just about being nice. It was smart for their business, too. Well, for one thing, they didn't lose all that talent and expertise that you often see with layoffs. They also minimized disruptions, so they could keep serving their customers. And they kept a good reputation in the industry.
It really shows that, doing right by your employees, it can be good for business, too.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the human side, that psychological contract, and we've looked at Enwave and how they did things differently. Let's talk about mergers and acquisitions. What are some of the challenges that come with that kind of transition?
Yeah, mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, as people call it.
Right.
They come with a whole other set of complexities. I think one of the biggest is just integrating two different company cultures.
Oh, yeah, like trying to mix oil and water.
Right. There can be personality clashes, conflicting priorities, just general uncertainty about the future. And it's not just the execs, right? It affects everyone in the company.
So it can be a recipe for disaster if you don't handle it well.
Totally. Another thing is, unrealistic expectations. Companies go into mergers thinking they're going to save all this money and see all these synergies, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Right. You have to be realistic about the challenges and know that it's going to take time.
Exactly. And don't forget about the customers. Mergers can be confusing for them, frustrating.
Oh, yeah. You can lose customers if you're not careful. I've definitely experienced that myself.
Right. Companies have to be really mindful of how their customers are going to react, and they have to minimize those disruptions. Communication is key again.
Speaking of communication, in the book, there's that story about Seagram spirits and wine business. They were being sold, and they had this interesting way of keeping their employees informed.
Oh, yeah. The CEO had this internal radio show,
Yeah.
which I thought was brilliant. It created this transparency, kept everyone connected during a really uncertain time. They knew that people needed information, especially during something like that. And they really made an effort to keep everyone in the loop.
It's so great to hear about a company that actually prioritized their employees, during a big transition like that.
It was refreshing. They weren't just controlling the message. They were trying to have a real conversation with their people and address their concerns.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that employees are human beings you know.
Yeah.
They're invested in the company's success.
Right. And when companies get that and they treat their employees with respect, it makes a world of difference. So we've talked about the downsides of mergers, but did the sources highlight any strategies, for making these things work?
Yeah, a couple of key things come up. One is strategic alignment. Make sure there's a good reason for the merger and that the two organizations are actually compatible. Goals, values, all of that.
Right. So it's not just about getting bigger or, taking out the competition. It's got to be a good fit.
Exactly. It should be about making something stronger than either company could be on its own.
Yeah.
And the other big one is that cultural integration.
Right. We talked about that a bit, but how do you actually blend two different cultures?
Yeah.
It seems almost impossible. It is tough, but it can be done. It takes a really deliberate approach.
Yeah.
You got to acknowledge the differences between the cultures, first of all.
Right. So it's not about making everyone be the same.
No, it's about using the strengths of both cultures and creating something new that everyone can get behind.
Yeah.
And the customer experience is crucial too.
Right. How do you make sure your customers aren't lost in the shuffle?
Communication is key. You have to tell them what's happening, what it means for them, what they can expect.
Be upfront with them.
Right. And listen to their feedback, be responsive. A merger, it can be a chance to improve the customer experience, but only if you're paying attention. Adaptability is so important here. Whether we're talking downsizing or mergers, you got to be able to adjust to change.
It's the only constant, it seems. So how do you create that culture of adaptability? How do you get people ready for all the changes that are coming?
That's a great question. And one that we're going to dig into a little bit more when we come back? Because things are changing so fast and we need to find a way to keep up.
So we're talking about, how do you create a culture of adaptability in companies?
Yeah. Especially
when it feels like things are always changing.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of leaders are thinking about right now. And I think the research, the stuff we've been looking at, it does give some good insights. One big thing is you got to change your mindset. You can't think of organizations like they're these fixed things anymore.
Mm.
It's got to be more fluid, more dynamic.
So not a rigid hierarchy, but more like a network.
Yeah.
Something that can bend and change.
Exactly. Like a living organism, it's always evolving and responding to the environment. And in that kind of environment, continuous learning, that's key.
Right. I mean, we talked about that before.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that look like, in a real company? What are some things companies can do to actually make that happen?
Well, it starts with, giving employees chances to develop their skills, to learn new things. So things like training programs, workshops, mentoring, even encouraging people to go back to school.
So it's not just about getting those new skills, but making learning part of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, you got it. You want to create this environment where people feel okay taking risks, trying new things, even messing up sometimes. Because, making mistakes, that's how we learn.
Right. It's about feeling safe to step outside that comfort zone.
Yeah, exactly. And realizing that learning, it never stops. It's not a one-time thing. Especially now, things change so fast. Skills can get outdated quickly. People got to keep updating their knowledge, adding new skills.
Like use it or lose it, but for learning.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about each employee, keeping up. It's about the whole company being open to new ideas, experimenting, always questioning how they do things.
Right. And that makes me think about that psychological contract again. If companies want their employees to be adaptable and keep learning, they have to do their part too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Companies have to show their employees that they're committed to their growth, not just say it, but actually do something.
Okay. So what would that look like in a company? How can they show that support?
Well, it starts with investing in their people, giving them access to good learning opportunities. That could be internal programs, workshops, sending them to conferences, or even helping pay for their degrees.
So putting your money where your mouth is,
Yeah.
Showing them that you're serious about their development.
Exactly. And it's not just about the money either. It's creating a supportive environment, where people are encouraged to learn and grow. So give them the time, the resources, recognize their effort, make it clear that learning is a good thing.
It sounds like creating a culture of adaptability.
Yeah.
It's not easy. There are a lot of pieces to it.
It is. It takes a shift in mindset, a commitment to learning, and a willingness to invest in your people.
Right. So before we wrap up, we talked about the skills that are going to be really important in the future. What are some of those that stand out, in a world where everything seems to be changing so fast?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, no one knows for sure what the future holds, but there are definitely some trends. We've already talked about adaptability and resilience, right? Being
Mhm.
able to go with the flow and bounce back from setbacks. That's going to be huge.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen how quickly things can turn upside down, you know?
Exactly. And another big one is going to be critical thinking, problem solving. As things get more complex, we're going to need more creative solutions.
So it's not just about following the rules anymore. It's about thinking for yourself, figuring things out.
Right. You got to be willing to question things, think outside the box.
Oh.
And you got to be able to see those connections, the patterns that other people
Oh.
miss.
It makes me think about technology too. With automation and AI and everything. People are worried that machines are going to take over all the jobs. But it seems like there's a chance for humans and machines to work together, you know?
Totally. As machines get better at doing the routine stuff, humans can focus on the things we're good at, like creativity, innovation, those things.
So it's not us versus them. It's more like a partnership.
Right. And for that partnership to work, we need to focus on developing the things that make us human, things that machines can't do, like empathy, emotional intelligence, communication, all of that.
It's those soft skills,
Yeah.
being able to connect with other people.
Exactly. And those are going to be even more important in the future because workplaces are getting more diverse, more global, and everything relies on teamwork now.
Well, this has been a really great deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much. The human side, the business side, mergers, adaptability, learning new skills. It's been a lot.
It has been fascinating. And I think what we've learned is that even though change can be hard, sometimes even painful, it also gives us a chance to grow, to innovate, to create something better.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
Not being afraid of change, but seeing it as a chance to learn and adapt and create.
Exactly. And that's something we can all do no matter what we do or where we work.
I love that. Well, a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us and to all of you listening for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new today that'll help you navigate all the changes that are coming.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.